I don't want to spend too much time on introducing this, but we're all very excited about the topic. It's really interesting to think how we have so much, so much emphasis on biculturalism and the symbolism of biculturalism, but to think about how little of that actually applies to our public spaces, as you're suggesting in your abstract, Neil. So it's a real pleasure to have you present on this today as somebody with such massive long experience of working as a landscape architect and working on these issues of Māori and Pākehā presence or co-presence in space. So I'll just hand over to you.
Okay, kia ora koutou te whānau whānau, kia ora mo tō mihi ki au, me hoki I mono tautoko te kaupapa nei. Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. It's great to have such a learned group, although slightly daunting, the expectations you have upon me here. Is this all coming through? Can you hear this? I can see you all waving and you're all on mute, so thank you. I'll take that as a read. I'll now move across to shared screen view, and perhaps if you, Gabriel, could just confirm that this is working, or at least let me know if it isn't. Where is my picture? Because I don't have it on my... Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
You can see a...
Yep, we can see your PowerPoint if you just do it.
Okay, so we have the PowerPoint come up. I'll try and keep this to around 20 minutes. So I'm a landscape architect. Until a few months ago, I was a senior lecturer in landscape architecture at Lincoln University, and I have since bravely and possibly naively branched out into other spaces since then. The most recent of which has been that I've spent the last couple of weeks on a road trip with Te Taunuku, the Māori Landscape Architects Group, where we've done a series of wānanga around the country talking about the culturally shared landscape and how it's made. And so this presentation today is based primarily on that, with a few tweaks and changes. And I guess so, and this is something obviously you've probably picked up on those seminars that you've run in the past that I've attended, that I'm particularly interested in the applied, grounded end of this conversation, and how concepts meet space. And so here we are looking at the cover and looking at, on the right-hand side, Aoraki Mount Cook, who is shyly covering his head. But we will come back to Aoraki at the end of the talk. So to go back to sort of 1840, Mohi Tāwhai, Hone Mohi Tāwhai said at Hokianga, in possibly the largest gathering to discuss the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, basically he was saying, don't sign, because if you sign, our sayings will sink to the bottom like a stone, but your Pākehā sayings will float light like the wood of the foul tree and always remain to be seen. And that pretty much is what has happened in the landscapes of this country. And what I'm talking about here is the shared landscapes. So I'm not talking about the landscape such as the one that is highlighted by the sign on the left-hand side here, which is at the gateway of a Kurikaupapa Māori, where I did some design work a few years ago, which, like marae and Māori universities and Māori medical centres and so on, are unequivocally Māori, in the same way that you don't expect a mosque to cater for Christian religious needs. You don't expect those spaces to cater for a wider cultural gambit. And the spaces that I'm interested in for this conversation anyway, excuse me, are the spaces that are shared. Those spaces that different cultural groups come together with, and I am unapologetically pretty much on the kaupapa Māori waka here. And so while there are obviously discussions about multiculturalism and the complexities that are associated with that, the discussion I'm primarily around here is the one of Māori and Pākehā. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about culture and space. It's a pretty quick theoretical overview. some ideas about sharing and not sharing. Different cultures do it differently, just to remind us. A little bit about sharing the cities, though a very short case study, in fact, part of a case study, and then we'll go back to Aoraki. So a little bit about theory, and we're looking at a series of pictures here, rotating through sort of, perhaps the one of New Zealand is the most atypical because you have to hunt this one out, but it makes the point of a gathering of people in marae and Christchurch, Nahoe Wha, practicing weaving. In the top right, we have a picture from Singapore, Chinatown, taken in Chinese New Year, and all those bits of spiraled plant in the front, they're called lucky bamboo, and because I think they're lucky for the orchard, for the nurseryman who sells them, but they will all go because it's called turn luck bamboo, and it will actually theoretically turn your luck around. And the picture at the bottom is from Veracruz in Mexico, and there's of people out in the main plaza who were going to be playing music. And should you ever be going to Mexico, don't make the mistake I did and get your hotel in the main plaza, because they will be playing their music until about 4:30. So different people are doing different things in different landscapes. To be honest, there's very little theory around this space. And one of an old but good one, and so worth recounting, is the work that was done by Lukaite Cinders, and I've never really known how to say her name, for which I apologise, on associations and park use. And she went out and looked at the way parks were being used in Los Angeles, and saw the way that different cultural groups were using them. And I guess the most notable thing there, if you look at the Hispanic column, is that 48% of the use by Hispanics was in family groups. And those family groups were not just the sort of Western family group of mum, dad, 2 kids and a dog. There were family groups of 3, 4, 5 generations, possibly with the dogs, probably with a mariachi band, quite likely with lights, and definitely claiming the space. In contrast, we have the group that goes out the most as an individual are the park outfielders, the white people. And that's kind of a major difference. And I'm not actually attempting to characterise these differences as good or bad. I think what I'm trying to do is characterise that there are differences. Interestingly, the only place where the different cultural groups came together and interacted was around the play areas, and particularly with children and mothers. But again, I'm holding that up not as a good or a bad thing, but I'm just holding it up as a thing. Now, what she found was that Chinese Americans didn't find the Western style open space, trees on a lawn kind of environment particularly satisfying. And so they weren't there in any great numbers because they weren't meeting their particular needs and their particular expectations of how this space should be. So what we get, therefore, is a situation where cultural diversity leads to different artefacts, even something as simple as gateways. Here on the left, the Tungjung Association Clan House on Haining Street, sadly no longer there, or still present, the gateway to the cemetery in Bruce Bay in southern South Westland, 2 very different expressions of the same need for a threshold. And perhaps the most obvious, and I'm sure many of you will have been to China and will have confronted that moment of realization when necessity leads to necessity, but nonetheless, it's something you have to work your way into. And I imagine that it is the other way around too for people from China when they come to the West and are confronted by Western-style toilets. But basically, this isn't random and interchangeable. It's deliberate, valued, culturally responsive, sorry about the spelling, because first of all, we make the world and then the world makes us. So we are shaped by the world that we have got created. And society is to a very large degree constituted through the buildings and spaces it makes, all of which can be summed up by saying that the physical world is a manifestation of the mental world constituted through culture. So 4 quick theories, basically going back almost to root theory rather than the more developed form, although in truth there is very limited more developed form. So to go back to sociology of Gertz, Blumer and Spadley, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, and symbolic interactionism, kind of the notion that the world and behaviour is deliberate as far as possible, that the physical infrastructure supports cultural behaviour, and cultural behaviour validates and supports the physical environment. Which, to translate this into the designer's language, which I normally try and talk with my professional colleagues, means that the design world is, or at least should be, a meaningful manifestation of culture. So what we build as designers should not only reflect culture, it should actually accommodate culture. Second one I've got here is Gibson, a psychologist who talked about affordances, and he was interested in affordances really from the way that we interpret the environment through objects. We read objects, and on the basis of those objects we understand what to do with them. When we see a door handle, we know that we rotate it, pull it, slide it, whatever, and then we move through into a different space. Now, my interest in this actually is not in the interpretation, but as turning this on its head is the idea of what we afford. The idea that the environment, that the environment is about what people need, and so should be shaped to afford what these activities that people want to undertake. The notion of affordances, but by us creating environments that afford particular activity. Another old but valid theoretical frame, and very useful to remind us about how we look after old people with seats or toilets, how the need for shelter, and the idea of self-actualization, and self-esteem, and notion of self-esteem I can pull out to a site we're going to talk about very briefly later this afternoon, which is a site in central Christchurch which used to be a cemetery, a Māori cemetery, and in the 1850s bones, koiwi, were exposed, I've read, in strong nor'west winds blowing the sand away. Now it's a car park, and quite a statement about the values that are seen in a cemetery, or at least more accurately seen in a Māori cemetery. And finally, I'll talk briefly here about a man called Jan Gehl. Sorry, this hasn't quite gone the way to. Jan Gehl, who's an architect and urban designer, and he's theorised the idea that there are necessary, optional, and spatial and social activities, and that determines how we use space. So that if we have to, it's a necessary activity, it's compulsory, waiting for a bus, going to school, perhaps going to the toilet. If needs must, you will go to the one that is there. Participation is only slightly influenced by the setting. In contrast, optional activities are undertaken when possible, for example, taking a walk, and choices are made where activities are based on the physical, the social, and the cultural environment. In other words, when you have a choice, you will make a choice, and your choice will be based around whether it meets your need physically, it meets your needs socially, it meets your needs culturally. And then social activities are those activities that depend upon others to greet, to watch, and to talk to. But the number of Gehl really is that people go where the environment works for them, which for those people who are concerned with the creation of environment means that we need to be creating environments that work for the people. It is an incredible truism, but in fact, for many designers lose track of the underlying imperatives that are driving what they do, in the face of the magnificent opportunities of creativity and the way it looks. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about sharing and not sharing, and with a bit of luck this will work. Sorry, it's taking a second to come up. Let me know if you aren't back at the PowerPoint. So there's an instance of a culturally shared space, a space that actually is flexible enough to allow Wales to come along and, or at least people from Wales to come along and sing the national anthem. It's flexible enough to accommodate that kind of activity, and some people have argued that the landscape is a stage. And that it's really, the question is about the props that you either create, have, or allow to be built there. Now let's contrast that with something that's going on in Christchurch at the moment, which is that there is a growing desire on the part of Christchurch's population to actually have to scatter the ashes of their loved ones in the parks. At the moment, there is a bylaw that prohibits this, and the City Council is currently considering changing this bylaw, which would then allow ashes to be scattered in any park. I should add, before you start thinking that Christchurch has got an evil right-wing, white-based local government, that in fact Auckland City Council doesn't have a bylaw about this at all. But iwi are opposed to this idea, and the reason they're opposed to this idea is because it means that all parks become cemeteries, which in turn means that the way that parks can be used is changed. That if you're playing around, running across the field, fall over, a piece of soil falls into the mouth, or at least bounced into your mouth, then you have consumed potentially a dead person. And so the question becomes one of how to manage this kind of aspiration. So on the one hand, we have space that is flexible enough to allow it to be shared. And on the other hand, we have space which, in part anyway, in some people's minds, could be structured so as to not allow it to be shared. And what are we sharing? The reality is that you need to have X-ray glasses to see Māori in the landscape of Aotearoa, that colonial economics and social systems have almost entirely displaced the Māori landscape with a different form and an aesthetic supporting different cultural patterns. And so on the left we have a picture of a farmhouse in Ekatahuna, no doubt hard won out of what was, by the look of it, once a verdant and lush forest landscape. And here on the right we have a picture of Christchurch Cathedral Square. Don't go don't ever come to Christchurch now looking to see that, because none of those buildings exist anymore. But nonetheless, the point remains that we're talking about a changed landscape that was built and afford different cultural practices and different values and different economics. Now, in Christchurch, there are 4 sites where there are Māori can be seen, which refer to a Māori past, 3 of which I show here. The 4th, which inexplicably I can't find my photos for, is a Plympton Cathedral Square, and the Plympton Cathedral Square has a piece of text on it which says, Māori came down from the North Island, they brought with them warfare, they exterminated the Moor, and they chopped down the forests. In other words, it has very conveniently placed Māori into the place of the other and into a misty time away from here. And where that same set of memorials names every single person who was on the first 4 ships that came into Christchurch in 1850, or at least into Lyttelton in 1850, not a single Māori inhabitant of Christchurch is named. Okay, so we're talking about a situation where the landscape is not manifesting Māori culture, where the environment has a whole lot of things that it needs to do, and where it's very clear, we can see from these photos here and from other photos I've shown you that different cultures do it differently. So on the right-hand side in Kaikoura, a picture of Maui pulling up the North Island, for those of you who might not know. In Māori narrative, the South Island was a waka on which Maui stood, and the place where he rested his foot while he was heaving on the mighty rope that was attached to the North Island, the place he had his foot was the Kaikoura Peninsula. This contrasts with another manifestation, which is a tomb in Delhi. I think part of the challenge is the notion of difference, and difference that is acceptable and difference that isn't. So on the one side here we have spirituality, which is picked up by many people, has a romantic appeal, and a lot of people kind of seem to like. And on the other hand, driving landscape change to an extent in terms of Ngāwhā prison, or some of the changes that have been made to roading systems through the Taranaki, through the Tainui Waikato area, is the notion of taniwha. And so we have spirituality on one side, good, maybe monsters on the other, perhaps weird, or the notion of mountains, which are pretty. And the example I always think of is of Aoraki Mount Cook, and of me walking down Revel Street in Hokitika, sat to the south and seeing the mountain and perhaps thinking, gosh, isn't the mountain nice? And perhaps the people at Arohura, just up the road, looking south from the marae and seeing the mountain and maybe thinking it's pretty, but also perhaps thinking, oh, there's my tipuna, my ancestor. And so maybe there's a commonality there. But on the other hand, we have the notion of ashes, and of how ashes, what ashes mean in terms of their being included in the environment. Although I have to add, I've done no work on that to know what Pākehā values might be in that space. So we can easily pick up on different values and different rationales, mountains and rivers, nature's views. We can all see those and perhaps enjoy them, although even this commonality isn't always manifest in what happens in the environment. Like Waihora and Canterbury is in a deleterious condition. The Waikato River apparently at Hooker Falls has a 15-metre visibility, and at the mouth has a 15-centimetre visibility. And there are many other sad indices as well of the disjunct here. But the reality is that the challenge that occurs for designers, as this sort of set of spreads I'm starting to show you suggests, is what to do when there are different values and different rationales. So different heroes. So in Wanganui, the Statue of Balance stood in Pākaitore until the occupation of that land, and then the statue was removed. Different site values, Three Kings in Auckland removed to be for a quarry. Different behaviours, sizes of groups and the needs for seats and tables. So that, for example, in Christchurch, there used to be a main street, Castro Street Mall, which had round seats, all as surrounding trees, nice trees. But the trouble with those round seats was that they only worked when there were two people sitting side by side. And if you had bigger groups than that, they couldn't all sit together. So some people often would end up sitting on the ground. So we're talking about the environment supporting modes of behaviour. And then there are, beyond those kind of behaviours, there's expectations, perhaps the need to welcome people and to take care of them. So let's shift now from this kind of theoretical frame to the idea of sharing the city, which is built upon, in this instance, some work I did with some students, in which students were required to look for cultural drivers, multicultural drivers in the urban form of Christchurch, to map these into a cohesive plan, and to carry out design work for this part of the city. And this wasn't a Ngaitahu project, but it was carried out with the support and knowledge of the runanga of Ngaitahu, and with Ngaitahu designers. And really this was phrased around Māori epistemology. What are the values? What are the beliefs? What are the behaviours? And what are the relationships? Which could be phrased in other ways as being mana atua, mana whenua, mana tanata. Or perhaps all that great list of tanatas that float around these days and works by Pauline and Awatere and others, rangatiratana, kaitiaki-tana, etc., etc. But the drivers for this are the same in across the country, whatever word or tangi you might want or not want to use, and that's the notion of historic sites, which could be past sites, cemeteries, the narratives that are embedded in the land, view sheds, sacred sites, cultural practice such as puhere, hosting, looking after the land, plus a number of others. And so looking at Christchurch, here is one of the plans that the students did. And so what this highlighted was, and I don't know if you can, I'll treat my mouse as though you can see it, I hope you can, a series of past sites around the city, a series of cemeteries, some major view sheds connecting things such as the Port Hills, and we could go the other way, connecting up to Maungatere, up to Mount Grey, pathway systems that were historic systems. So anyone who knows Christchurch, the reason that we have High Street and Victoria Street is because the Avon River was relatively shallow at this point, and so people were able to ford the river, and so there was a traditional Māori track there, and so a road system developed. In other words, a series of drivers in the physical landscape. And just to have one short example, because time is, I'm aware that I'm on the last 4 or 5 minutes of this presentation, is an instance of, and this is student work, so it's not necessarily the flashiest, but it's interesting ideas. So this was taking the site that I talked about before, the cemetery site, now a car park, and actually building a big meeting room above it that connects into City Council, above a water feature. On the water feature, there would be photos played via slide or some other such technique of sort of history and of old people, and a link way through into the site, into the building. Well, here, this is St. Luke's Church in Manchester Street, where Tautahi, a Māori name for Christchurch, is Utautahi. Tautahi is the person who that name comes from, and he is buried in this area here. And so the proposal was to link his cemetery site, this sacred site, using spring water that comes up out of the ground in here, down through this area to the Avon River, which goes past the site of the Pine Gold Guinness building where so many people were killed in the Christchurch earthquake. So sewing together two different narratives around the notion of sacredness. Now that's the only examples I've got here for my design colleagues. I showed a lot, but I was given more time to talk to them. But what we're talking about here is layers of content, where historics, values, linkages and connections, where we're talking about spirituality, expressing prestige, looking after the land values of Kaitiakitana, accommodating modes of behaviour, looking at identity and a range of other Māori aspirations and behaviours as well. So what I've talked about here is actually only one half of the sharing. But what really I was trying to do with this is to not so much illustrate the act of sharing as to illustrate the potential for introduce other modes and other value systems into the environment that respond to culture in a meaningful way. Now, the last little part of this is to go back to Aoraki no longer hiding his head. So Aoraki is the tallest mountain in New Zealand, of course, in the centre of an important national park. It's part of a key climbing area, first climbed in 1894, and it's hard not to go there and gasp because it is such an impressive sight. But we can compare that to the Ngaitahu narrative, which is that when Raki, the sky, and notice that would be Rani for those of you from up north. I don't say my G's, which complicates things a little bit, but anyway, Raki, the sky father in Kaitahu dialect, married Papa Tōnuku, and but Raki already had some children, the sky children, and they came down to see his new wife, Raki. And this included 4 of Raki's children, Aoraki, Raki Ora, Raki Nui, and Raraki Roa. And they came down and they had a good time, as young men are wont to do, and went up to Hawaii for a while and mucked around and hung out. And then they eventually decided to go south, and they came south, and they got down to the area of Te Waiponamu, and they found it a bit cold, and they thought, oh, well, bugger this, let's go home then. But they said the wrong karakia, and their waka was turned upside down, and they ended up falling into the water, and they climbed onto the back of their waka, and they sat there and nothing happened until eventually they turned to stone. They ossified to stone, and they became these important maunga in the Southern Alps. So now what we've got is 2 very different narratives about the same place. Aoraki is shared, but it means different things, and it expresses different values. And the challenge is to manifest value and respect both, so that the Māori and the Pākehā face can be seen in the landscape. And that there ends that lesson. I'll just close this, which I don't think I need to. So that brings that up. So that's my bit done, actually. And I think it's now back to you, April.
Okay, kia ora, Neil. I think Melanie's got some.
You just need to go up to that part that says options at the top.
Yep.
You see that? The little arrow?
Yes.
Way up the top.
Way up the top, and there should be the option to stop sharing.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Okay, that's good.
I've got to take my hat off. You did a genius job of managing this new technology all by yourself.
It's very strange talking to no one, I have to say.
Yeah. Don't worry, you weren't talking to no one, and we had our silenced things, but we were exclaiming and laughing in all the appropriate places, and I bet everybody else was too around the kitchen. So,
good.
Sorry to do that to you. Okay, so let's just see what comments and questions there are. I'm sure there's lots of comments and questions out there that people have running away. Robin, are you reaching for your microphone?
Yeah, I am, but I don't know what my question is. I really just wanted to thank Neil because it was fantastic. I don't know. Fiona and I have worked on a project with the Massey site in Wellington, which is on Pukeahu, and have had a a whole range of people involved in surfacing some of the non-Pākehā history of Pukeahu for the, in order for us to understand better what that shared landscape might mean more. And certainly what you're talking about are all the issues that we've been kind of trying to think our way through, but not really knowing how to articulate it. So I think you're doing fantastic and really important work by talking presumably to the design community about that, where so often the default is to a sort of set of Pākehā design issues. One of the things I'm kind of curious about, and that's been a curiosity for me for a long time, is how this works with the landscape of trees. Because we have some really conflicting things going on with tree landscape histories, because we have an indigenous body of trees and a non-indigenous body of trees, and very few people even know the difference between which trees are which. But even within New Zealand, indigenous trees that belong to one rohe have ended up being transplanted into other rohe, and people don't really understand that either. Do you know of anyone who's doing any work in that area?
There's some work being done by people like Herbie Sheltis, looking at ecological sourcing. I mean, I think the most ecological sourcing of plant materials is probably the most significant work in this area. And some work has been done around that. Of course, the other side of that is, in fact, the sharing side of it. And I don't think we have anyone here from Auckland, but in Auckland, as some of you will know, is that the park is at Albert Park, just by the Auckland University, and there's some oak trees in there, and those oak trees have been colonised by ferns and epiphytes of various sorts from that are indigenous. And so, although on the one hand it can be a conflicting kind of either or scenario, in fact, I think the notion of sharing is about the notion of new futures. And that is kind of, in a way, is the challenge to find a direction into a new future that is a new culture, really. It's about finding cultural expression.
Thanks.
Goodness, my brain's going now.
Yeah.
I want to thank you too, Neil, and I've been, because as I said at the beginning, I've just discovered place, and one of the place-based projects I'm working on, I'm trying to write something at the moment about, I don't know if you ever get to the far north, there's a new community complex in Kaitaia called Te Ahu, and I'm trying to write something about the history of the place, the site, and about the fact that it's always, from pre-colonial times, been a meeting place. But my knowledge of the pre-colonial history is very, very thin, very, very slight, nothing like your students with that, and obviously your knowledge around Christchurch places and the land use, pathways and the urupā and all that. But I kind of want to make an argument that this building is part of a process of resurfacing Māori relationships to place and building, making those present. But it's really exciting looking at all those, like the layers of content that you're talking about, to think about what else might be done in a place like that. And I think this links to what Robin and Fiona have been doing with the campus in Wellington too, that, how else you can bring those things back into the material present through the kinds of things that your students have designed. Would be fantastic. I mean, what is happening with any of those things? Any chance of any of them coming to fruition?
Oh, probably not. The trouble, any of you who've worked, you're all in academia in one form or other, and so you all know that students are delightfully unfettered by the grim realities of life. And so the thing that is fantastic about students is they throw up ideas that bear no relationship to the finances or anything else. But the thing that's fantastic about them is exactly that same thing.
Yeah,
On the one hand, it's a challenge and a pain in the neck, and on the other hand, it's wonderful. And so really what my students' work does is, or did, as I'm not at Lincoln now, but what my students' work did was that it highlighted potentials and opportunities. And perhaps the best example I can think of is we did some design work for a Māori community on the west coast of the South Island, and we came up with 3 or 4 alternative marae designs, and in the end they, for a whole series of reasons, they said, well look, these are great, but none of them do what we want them to do, and they ended up doing something different. But that was fantastic because we saved them $3 million by going down the wrong road.
yeah.
Showed them the road and they realised it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so capturing their dream, as we hoped we did anyway, didn't show them that their dream wasn't the one they really wanted after all.
Yeah.
And that was actually great. If, you know, taking quite a positive spin, yes, it would be nice to see a kind of a perpetuity kind of relic there, but actually from a community point of view, that was a terrific benefit. Just to go back to what you were saying, it sounds great that you're looking at this work up in Kaitaia, a place I'm afraid I don't get. Kaitaia is a long way from here, but anyway, there are 2 facets I caution you to remember of this. It's very easy to grab hold of the historic component of a Māori relationship, to grab hold of the old stories, the cemeteries, the power sites, the fishing sites, all the other things that did happen once.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is to remember that Māori culture is not dead.
Mm-hmm.
And to actually ensure that the work that you do manifests the cultural behaviours in a way that allows the culture to exist in a contemporaneous sense. And so the instance that I didn't talk about in the example that I showed was the Victoria Square, which is actually being proposed by Ngaitahu as being sort of the meeting place, because there's going to be a new convention centre built next to it for 2,000 people. And so that then becomes the place where perhaps the pohiri is enacted. So you do the rituals of welcome on that particular landscape. So it's not. So we've got these you could call them 2 layers. There's the layer of the old and the layer of the new. Although I think, I can't remember who said it now, but some Māori academic at some point said that the challenge is not to find value in the old, it's just to find ways to represent it in the present.
Yeah, and not just to represent the old, as you say, that's a very good reminder. It's about what Māori want to do with a public space like that now. You know,
well, it's about what they want to do, but how do they behave? How do Māori behave?
Yeah.
What are modes of behaviour? You know, I mean, we've probably all been in this situation. We just did this one on the series. I did it for a professional organisation. They were all very excited and they were delighted the number of people who attended. And then when we start going back, like I was saying, with our receipts, our claims forms, we're saying actually we gave out $1,500 in koha to people who supported us. They're going, koha? You can't do that. You've got no receipts. You can't have it bloody both ways. You can't enjoy the culture but pick and choose. The culture's the culture.
Yeah. I could talk to you all day. I'm probably, but I better let some other people have a chance to make a comment or ask a question. Anybody?
I just have one
Yeah.
comment. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I just have one comment, if you can just explain more. So when you talk about representation of Maori culture, talking about identity point of view, is more like talking about that collective culture, that collective identity. And I'm just doubting how in implementation stage, how you can represent that collective culture in more or less individualistic culture at the same time that you want to integrate these both in the same public kind of place. That's something, because I'm struggling with this kind of concept in my own thesis, and this is where I come to this idea that is it really kind of practical to kind of integrate all these different cultures from individualism and collectivism point of view in the same spatial setting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a good architecture question for you, or planning.
Thank you. That is a good question. I've never sort of thought about it in those terms of individualistic versus more group based. I mean, first of all, just in terms of the collective, I must add that it's really about mana whenua and the people of that place. So which means most likely it's going to be possibly an iwi, more likely a hapu, quite possibly a family whānau based kind of issue that you're talking about. In terms of behaviours, so we have some people who like to sit by themselves and we have some people who like to sit in groups. And so that means that you design your environment so that there are some seats that are by themselves and there are some seats that allow people to sit together in little groups. It's about allowing diversity within the frame and the forms that we create. In terms of contemporary behaviours, that would be what I would be saying. So that I talked before about the round seats around the trees. And I long rallied against that and argued with my students that it was wrong. And I took great delight when my seat just sagged, sorry. I took great delight, it's got a lever and I knocked it with my leg. Took great delight when the new design was put up that actually had a whole range of social alternatives created within the seating arrangements. So there was scope to sit in small groups. There was scope for homies to hang around. There was scope for people to sit by themselves and read the newspaper. And so I think that it's about what you are allowing to happen. For me, it goes back to those modes of behaviour, those social values, rather than being about individuals, about a more individualistic and a more collective-based society. I mean, it's actually about accommodating those different values and behaviours within the environment that is created. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. But I was going to say that if they do have clashes, like in terms of, like, for example, those activities that young Bill talk about in public spaces about necessary, optional, and social. I don't know, like, for example, if Maori people, for example, have different public spaces, have different functions for them, comparing with, like, for example, KVs. I don't know, I'm just asking. And if they're kind of different usage of the public space clashes together, that's what I'm asking. And then when I talked about that collectivism and individualism, I was thinking if that collective kind of culture and individualistic kind of culture affect the way that you're using your space. And it's clash.
I'll start at the end because that's the one I can remember best. Yes, the collectivism versus the individualistic is going to determine the way the space is used. So in the best instance there is the size of the group. And so how many chairs do you need around your table? So that, you go to any cafe with an outdoor seating area and say you want a table. If there's 3 of you, it'll be no trouble, but if there's 10, you're in the ship. And so, yeah, that corporate sort of, that cultural behaviour does make a big difference. But it also makes a difference to what you need. Yeah. And in fact, I would argue that some spaces, every space doesn't have to be populated to the same degree by every ethnic group in order for us to feel validated.
Yeah, that's right.
That, in my view, it's quite acceptable that some spaces are used by some groups and some people are used more by others. We don't get upset about young people using a space and not many old people there. And I'm not trying to say that spaces should be exclusive, but I suppose I am saying that sometimes the reality of what you're discussing and the points you're raising means that every space can't do everything for everyone at the same time. So maybe we have to accept that that's the reality and we design enough spaces that do enough of the right things to work across the society overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the moment, the reality in New Zealand is that the only spaces that actually work from Māori point of view are the spaces, those small remnants that are in Māori control and ownership. Marae, Kurukapapa Māori, Wānanga, and so on. They're the only ones where it works now. And the other spaces fundamentally don't accommodate Māori values and needs.
Do you have a sense, a strong, or a clear sense, is maybe asking a bit much, a sense of what, if you're just talking about a public space like a park, what would be different for it to meet Māori needs and values?
I think that I think there's a very good chance that the park is going to be, as it stands at the moment, will be populated by dead white men on plinths.
Yeah.
And so what are the narratives that are going to, what are the narratives that are missing from that conversation in terms of who isn't represented there? Obviously, almost certainly women, but beyond that, what Māori could be included in the narrative system that's there? What are the plant materials? Because although I was talking about the loveliness of seeing orchids in the oak trees in Mount Albert, I think that seeing native plants in the parks would probably be something that would be enjoyed. I think that it might mean that on occasions the park will have a different social function, and so perhaps you might need to allow it to have hangi. It is a radical idea. Go and dig up your park and have hangi in it. Or have big social groups there, and you might have a pōkeri, or you might play touch. You might have a higher level of environmental care because you're trying to look after the land in a better way. You might maintain a view that links through to the important mountain or the river or some other narratives that are significant to the local hapu or iwi. Now, there's a range of things you can grab hold of and do, and frequently they're not big things or hard things. They're things you just have to kind of think about.
The Pukeahu Park, the new National War Memorial Park,
Yes.
has got the 3 big rocks that have been brought down from Taranaki to symbolise that connection with the people of Parihaka. And it's got Hine, the statue that is closest to the entrance is of Hine, I can't remember her name, but she's one of the few, women cast in bronze in New Zealand, and certainly one of the only Māori women. And they have done that really interesting thing, because it also represents the Anzac space, of planting part of the park in gum trees. So whoever has done the design of that park has thought about some of those things in quite radically different ways from how they've been thought about in the past. But it still feels like it's a little bit edgy, a little bit.
I haven't had the pleasure of going there yet. But yeah, I mean, it's a thoughtfulness in recognising a different framework for thought.
I'm just aware that we're really oh, got the echo. We're on time, but have we got anybody out there that hasn't had a chance to say something that would like to chip in a comment or a...
Kia ora, Neil. That was a great presentation. I'm just interested if you gave the Rebuilding Christchurch a scorecard, some mark on a scorecard, how would you say we're going in relation to, we've had from a catastrophic event, we've had a great opportunity to perhaps change the landscape and provide opportunity for more bicultural sharing of this landscape in the city. How do you think we're going?
In terms of, there is very little built, as you know, because you're a Canterbury, I think, aren't you? Yeah.
Yes.
So as you know, there's very little built on the ground, and so we can't see from the built work yet And of course, most of the designs are done in smoke-filled rooms with windows painted out. And so we really haven't seen very much of the kind of product. The one thing that we have seen is the changes that have been done to the Avon River, Papatakoro, and they are manifesting a significant attempt at ecological improvement, which is a primary concern of Ngāi And in that sense, we do seem to be making some headway. My friends and associates who are in the space a bit more actively than me, at intervals express concerns that it's rather harder going than they would like to get real runs on the board as opposed to the token run. So as for a score, I'll give us a 6.5 at the moment, but I'm hopeful that when we see things like the Justice Precinct, and everyone's telling me that it's going to be wonderful, perhaps we'll get up to a 7.5 or an 8.
Okay, thank you.